This is the real video? Oh wow. Hello my loves and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to react to Khamar-Daban incident that is kind of related to the Dial of Past incident in terms of mystery.
Bleeding profusely from the ears and foaming at the mouth, 6 of the 7 members of the group had now descended into what could only be described as madness, witnessed only by one unscathed and uncertain 17-year-old. The bodies of the 6 group members had to remain alone for weeks, visited only by scavengers, until August 26th, although some reports say it was the 21st, because the mountains were far too windy and dangerous to find and recover the bodies safely. Members of the search and rescue...
Bruh. It's like every video was the same thing. I mean, yes, I know that safety is important, but they knew that if they wouldn't send anybody there, I mean, you have dogs, you can like find a way to just, I don't know, find those people, because they knew if they would come 2 or more weeks later, they would not find the reason or the cause for all of this. They knew that.
Sent to the scene of the incident by helicopter recall that the bodies were paired off in smaller groups, scattered across 40 to 50 meters of ground.
This is the real video? Oh wow.
The 6 hikers, previously young, strong, virulent, and full of life, were now reduced to bloated and swollen corpses, with death imprinted grimaces on their faces and in partial states of undress of their many layers, with some only wearing their thin, full-bodied undergarments. 3 of the stricken were without shoes, a fact which lined up with Val's recollection of the hikers desperately ripping off their garments. Workers recall that Corvina was lying on top of Sasha, possibly in one last act of protection. Rescue workers recall that scavengers had eaten their eyes and tongues, as the soft tissue is a common target after death. The condition of the bodies left little artifacts for the coroner to examine, and the windstorm that had ravaged the area had likely swept away any non-bodily evidence from the scene. The official autopsy reports done in the city of Ulan-Ude in East Siberia state that the cause of death for all 6 hikers was hypothermia. Friends and family took umbrage at the obvious elephant in the room. It seemed very suspicious that, given the area's annual highs and lows for the time of year, the lows for the area averaged in the 50s at night, roughly 10 degrees Celsius, that the hikers simply froze to death in the summertime, while one person, a 17-year-old teenager at that, one who was not the biggest nor the strongest of the group, would survive, and not only survive but do so for an additional 3 days, and be seemingly unaffected whatsoever and cognitively sound, seemed unbelievable.
This is also why I say that one of the causes, maybe, could have been hypothermia, because what they exhibited, you know, the ripping their clothes, is the cause of that. But, is an effect of that. But, why did one girl survive and the rest die? You see what I mean? She was also there. She basically didn't have, you know, more clothes than anybody else. You know, I think that they were told what to pack. So, it doesn't make sense. You see? Because if they would have all perished, they would have said, yeah, it was hypothermia, but they didn't. You cannot say that it was that when one person was still alive.
Believable for those left behind, who were filled with questions and uncertainty. In support of the hypothermia theory, it had been raining for more than 24 hours at the point that the group members started exhibiting symptoms. That, combined with the wind chill factor, would have led to very cold conditions. Because human bodies experiencing hypothermia feel like they're warm, but they're actually going into a state of shock, there have been documented cases of hypothermic patients ripping at their clothes, feeling like they're too warm, rather than actually currently freezing to death. Some say the fact that the hikers ripped their clothes off demonstrated that they were experiencing that type of sensation. Besides this symptom, however, the theory seems to have few parallels with the horrors witnessed by Val, namely the bleeding from the ears, foaming at the mouth, and banging one's head against the rocks. Nowhere in any documented cases of hypothermic patients were such antics observed. Quite to the contrary, in fact, people freezing to death often become slower and more lethargic over time, and eventually stop to take their final rest and pass without violent or even visible symptoms. Additionally, while the weather was inclement and stormy, it was still August, summertime. It was not the dead of winter or even in the winter months. Additionally, experts claim that hypothermia being the cause of death does not make sense because that area was not a desert where temperatures can fluctuate rapidly, and as it was August in a forest, the elements, however unyielding, could not have caused such an instantaneous cold with such fatal results. Theories are varied, but with the limited press coverage of this particular incident and the lack of information from Val, theories are all the families of survivors have to hold on to in hopes of receiving some sort of explanation or closure. Later, in what some would say is victim blaming, but others say is just common sense, it is said that in Corvina's insistence that they stay on schedule so as to meet up with her daughter and their hiking group on time, and to not miss the allotted intersection window, that she made a rash decision which snowballed into a series of fatal mistakes, which led to the death of her charges. Critics say that her unwillingness to traverse a couple miles out of the way in order to seek shelter in the trees could be reasoned as a major contributing factor to the exposure death. But none of this explains why the group members were foaming at the mouth or bleeding from the ears, as that is not a known symptom of exposure.
Yes. Oh.
One theory is that the KGB, the Russian Committee for State Security, was testing some new type of weapon, possibly sound or nuclear-based. Some wonder if this could have been a type of weapon which could incapacitate and cause fatalities from some distance away. There is also speculation that a nerve agent of some sort could have been either knowingly or unknowingly unleashed on the unsuspecting campers, as bleeding from the ears is a common symptom of nerve agents. This theory is fueled by the strangeness of the lack of details and the inconsistencies in official reports and media coverage. This conspiracy speculates that Val, as the only witness to the hypothetical government activities, was paid off, and that is the reasoning behind her decision to move far away, and her reluctance to discuss the matter. This type of hypothetical weapon, however, doesn't explain why Val was unharmed in the supposed testing, and this theory is more based on conspiracy rather than any concrete evidence. Some postulate that the group's symptoms could align with the consumption of poison mushrooms or some other food-based toxin. Others wonder if their water was contaminated. Some asked if the stew that they consumed as their last meal contained toxins in some form, but doctors interviewed stressed that due to different body metabolism and different enzymatic reactions, that kind of food-based sickness or poisoning would affect each in a slightly different way and at different times. Not so synchronously, as Val recalls it. No evidence of a food-based illness existed in the autopsy report, and Val recalls that she and the group members shared all food. In response to the fact that they all shared the same food, those researching the case wonder if Val was protected somehow, perhaps by a secret Corvina was hiding in her rucksack. Some wonder if the sole survivor, Val, may have been the only one to eat the so-called golden root plant that Corvina had been surreptitiously collecting along their trip, an act that possibly protected Val from whatever harm befell the group, be it from a natural or a man-made source. Goldenroot, its scientific name Rhodiola rosea, is a perennial that grows in the wild in the mountains of Siberia. The raw roots are said to be limitless in their potential for medicinal use. In the early 50s, Russian scientists classified goldenroot as a, quote, adaptogen because it has the potential to create a bodily resistance to certain toxins and supports one's adaptation to various stressors that might befall the taker. The goldenroot also contains a chemical called sildenafil. Sildenafil is the active ingredient in the ED drug Viagra. For this reason, the root has a high resale value, especially in remote areas without access to prescription drugs. Goldenroot has an incredibly slow pattern of growth and only has the potential to help people medicinally when fully matured, after nearly 12 years of growth.
Yo, I swear to God. Did you see that? Oh my God, that was so crazy. It got tangled in my hair. If I catch you, I'm looking at it right now. If I catch you, it's over.
This long growing period and the root's presence in limited regions makes fully grown golden roots highly valuable and sought after. Rescue workers found a bag of these roots, and some say that this amount shows that Korovina took more than needed, ostensibly to sell for profit. While some theorize that the consumption of this root was beneficial to Val in that it possibly saved her life, others wonder if the plant was actually the root of all their problems. Those indigenous to the area believe that the golden root has mystical properties, and Siberian folklore states that those who take more than they need for just personal consumption will be spiritually punished. Due to a lack of access to official statements, it is unknown whether Val actually consumed the roots and if they aided her somehow. Was there another death on the mountain? Did another person die on the mountain with the same symptoms of foaming at the mouth and bleeding from the ears? Some sources report that another fatality may have occurred on the same mountain. But no more information is given, and coverage is not only suspiciously light on the actual group's incident, but also in Russian and therefore translated through Google Translate by those who wish to research the incident decades later. Friends of Korovina admit that while Korovina could be extreme in her approach to survivalism, employing tactics that would help the group if they ever encountered an emergency situation, those close to her say that Korovina never took outdoor education to the extreme that her charges would be in danger. A Russian media source initially claimed that the group was food insecure, claiming that the presence of a single soup can and a small tin of meat left at the campsite shows that the group was running on empty, though most unlikely. The medical examiner considered it because of the absence of insulin in post-mortem blood samples of the victims. The only other medical reason that could explain this lack of glucose in the blood of the deceased, however, would be similar to a diabetic-like type of insulin resistance, but how that could have affected an entire group is unknown. The first issue.
This is where everything becomes weird. They have just said that they were missing insulin or their body wasn't producing enough insulin on all members at the same time, because it basically happened at the same time. People that, although they were acquainted with each other, they were not living in the same house, they were not living in the same, I don't know, building or whatever. You see, it's way too much of a coincidence, and I haven't really read any official statement, but all the theories that she just said up until now, pretty much every single one of them tries to 100% make Korovina the, the bad guy. And not because she's the narrator. I'm going to say this again because I don't want people to just think that I'm bashing somebody. I'm just saying that how the official statements and the coverage of this actual case tries so hard to make Korovina the only factor of those people's deaths. And that's not even true. There's so many coincidences, all of them having the same, I don't know, all of them having the same symptoms, all of them having the same body problem about the insulin, all of them just basically dying minutes or more of each other. I mean, that's just crazy. But what I don't understand is how one person survived.
Issue with the theory that the group was experiencing the effects of malnutrition is that the media source was basing their assumptions on the presence or lack thereof of food waste at the campsite. But those in the backpacking community understand that the best and most respectful hikers always pack out their trash so as to avoid contaminating the area. And because the scene of the incident was not sealed nor protected from the elements for many weeks, it's possible that scavengers and the weather took what remained of the group's food rations and waste. Moreover, it's only logical to think that even if the group was malnourished, they would have slowly wasted away and would not have gone wild, banging their heads against the rocks and bleeding from the ears. No publications on those types of symptoms occurring in the actions of those who have starved to death exist, as mania and orifice bleeding are not symptoms of starvation. For this reason, the theory of malnutrition is not one taken seriously, and mostly originated in the original Russian media write-ups that relied heavily on second-hand information of the search group, and not from Val herself. This reliance on second-hand information caused the media to make sweeping assumptions without ever knowing the history of Korovina or her skill sets and methodology. A friend recalls that Korovina was a stickler for survivalist learning, but she was also someone who would have insisted the hikers be nourished before pressing on, and would not have allowed the young hikers to become so malnourished that they encountered death. Many speak of the professionalism of Korovina, as she was all about triple-checking the supplies. Val, the survivor of the group, says that they planned to have enough food to consume 2,400 calories a day, and that food was not a factor in their untimely demise. The tallest part of the mountain the group climbed that day reached a peak of 2,396 meters. And when the group stopped to rest, they were at 2,300 meters, which is about 7,545 feet above sea level. A high altitude, but not one so high that it would cause such extreme illness. For comparison purposes, the lodge at Heavenly in South Lake Tahoe, a common respite for people of all health and ability levels, as well as by families with children, has a base altitude of around 2,000 meters, 6,000 feet, and peaks just above 3,068 meters, or around 10,000 feet. This resort and its slopes are enjoyed by those who have driven from San Francisco, a sea-level city, the same day. And while altitude sickness can happen at the resort's highest peaks, it is never as extreme as what the group experienced. Moreover, in the South Lake Tahoe Lodge, at the base level of the resort where the hotel is located, which is an almost exact altitude to what the stricken hikers were experiencing, altitude sickness is almost unheard of. And when it manifests itself, it's usually in the form of a headache or light nausea, remedied often by only water. High-altitude pulmonary edema can cause bleeding from the eyes, but bleeding from the ears is not mentioned in the symptoms. Moreover, high-altitude pulmonary edema, or cerebral edema, often causes symptoms closer to drunkenness rather than rage, violence, or panic. While the hiker's hometown of Petropavlovsk is only 150 meters, roughly 500 feet above sea level, the hikers had almost a week to acclimate to the increased altitude, so the claims that they could have been sickened with extreme altitude poisoning is doubted by many. Additionally, altitude sickness affects everybody differently, depending on many factors. So the fact that all of the group members went mad and were sickened at relatively the same time is not conducive to altitude sickness. Many believe the lack of correlation with the known symptoms of altitude sickness and the data of the hikers' trek upwards show that a force other than the altitude was responsible for the death of 6 previously joyous adventurers. What many believe to be the most logical and explanatory theory, while still not completely perfect in its explanation, lies in the hidden and largely untapped power of sound as a weapon. Some wonder if the Mongolian cyclone which overtook the area was actually an anticyclone. While a cyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a center of low atmospheric pressure, an anticyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a high atmospheric pressure, with varied results. Some theorize that this particular anticyclone caused such an intense wind that magnetic vibrations began to descend upon the hikers, and when combined with the strong air currents, it set in motion a strange and largely obscure phenomenon called infrasound. While sound has been publicly investigated as a weapon of war from as early as 1957, but most likely far before that in sealed military research, this particular instance of infrasound is hypothesized to have been created by the wind, and that the wind created such a low noise that it became unsettling and possibly fatal. According to one article, the large boulders present on the ridge that the hikers stopped to rest on, when hit with unusually strong winds at a certain angle, can become a, quote, infrasonic generator of enormous power, which causes a person to experience a state of panic and unaccountable horror. Because airborne sound of sufficient intensity enters the body by direct absorption, and in turn stimulates the non-auditory tissue, infrasound can produce physiological effects, essentially similar to a whole-body seizure. This low-frequency noise can be perceived by the brain but not by the ears on a conscious level. When exposed to these types of sounds, the human body has the potential to react to a noise of which it does not actually realize it is hearing. Such a sensation can lead to strange feelings of terror and panic, similar to what Val recalls witnessing. Experts researching infrasound for military-grade weapons explain that the high-intensity acoustic energy can have a myriad of consequences. It can affect one's hearing, either temporarily or permanently. It can cause increases in the heart rate and blood pressure, as well as pain, vertigo, nausea, and vomiting. According to scientists looking at infrasound as a weapon, the most dangerous frequency of sound for the brain to experience is one that mirrors the, quote, median alpha rhythm frequencies of the brain, which is 7 Hz. The article goes on to state that the reason for the high level of danger associated with this incredibly low frequency is that 7 Hz is also the resonant frequency of the body's own organs. So this sound can directly affect the human central nervous system. Current literature on the subject says that exposure to low-frequency acoustic energy could result in disorientation, and with that, an understandable amount of panic and anxiety. Along with those common symptoms, more physical responses to this low frequency of below 7 Hz sound has been experienced with more side effects, such as bowel spasms, nausea, vomiting, collapsed lungs, and even, when exposed to the sound long enough, organ rupture and death. Restlessness and confused speech was present in the 6 victims, according to Val, along with disorientation and anxiety. But notably missing from the slew of symptoms of infrasound is the bleeding from the ears. The effects of infrasound at high altitudes has also not been explored, because the mechanisms of such scientific inquiry are complicated. As many would say, inflicting such sounds on those animals closest to humans for scientific purposes is unnecessarily cruel. As human test subjects are not queuing up to be exposed to such damaging sensations, and at a high altitude to boot, our knowledge of the intricacies of infrasound are limited at best, and therefore there could be symptoms to which we are not privy. Because each human brain and nervous system is unique in its capabilities and perceptions, not everyone is affected by infrasound in the same ways, which could be why Val was not a victim. Her age, gender, and bodily capabilities may have precluded her from such forces and symptoms. Because sound affects different people in different ways, this could be the reason that Sasha started to get sick first, and that the others followed shortly after. Perhaps Sasha was more affected by the frequency due to his age and gender. He was the oldest male on the trip. Speculation is all that remains of this tragedy, as it is considered a closed case due to the coroner's contention that the deaths were caused by hypothermia. For now, at least, the friends and families of these 6 beloved explorers will continue to wonder what unexpected fate befell them. Even years later, Val refuses to discuss the tragedy with reporters, saying once in a response to a request for an interview, quote, "Do you think I want to remember this nightmare? I had to leave, change my whole life. I don't want to remember it."
He said the one with the altitude sickness, the weather conditions, the infrasound, the food poisoning. I think it was all of that. And because the people that died actually experienced these same symptoms and they died, but it was, in an interval of minutes, and it was different because the first one to get sick was the oldest man, and then, it was Corvina, then I think that the youngest girl beat, the surviving woman. So I think that it was an accumulation of everything, because throughout this whole story, and I don't know if I'm right, we don't have details about the woman that survived. We don't know what she felt, what happened to her in that moment, because we know the symptoms and the actions of the other people, but one person, because of the shock that she went through, we don't really know how she felt at that moment, how she acted. It was such a shock that maybe she didn't remember. We also don't have a lot of info. So I do think that it was an accumulation of all of the theories. And if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, comment down below, and subscribe so you can be a part of our family. All right, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.